You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
Whether or not you're a futurologist or a prognosticator, the future of war is a pretty enticing topic. Not everyone has a ghost fleet sitting in their back pocket. Not everyone has a Death Star roaming around the neighbourhood. But what is it about the future of war that we get right? And what is it about the future of war that we get wrong? I actually don't have any answers for you, but that's why I do this show. G'day listeners, and welcome back to the Dead Prussian podcast. You are listening to your host, probably not the humblest host, but the humblest host with a show named after a Prussian military theorist. Thanks very much for all your support. I'm going to give this a short intro because my long intros have been a bit too long on the previous shows and I'll listen to your feedback. Now, today we're talking about the future of war, and my guest is Sir Lawrence Freedman. I'm sure quite a few of you know who he is. He's the Emeritus Professor of War Studies at King's College London. He has been described as the Dean of British Strategic Studies and has been a Professor of War Studies at King's College London since 1982 and Vice Principal since 2003. He was educated at Whitley Bay Grammar School and the Universities of Manchester, York and Oxford. Before joining King's, he held research appointments at Nuffield College, Oxford, IISS and the Royal Institute of International Affairs. He was elected a Fellow of the British Academy in 1995 and awarded the Commander of the British Empire in 1996. He was appointed Official Historian of the Falklands Campaign in 1997. He was awarded Knight Commander of St Michael and St George in 2003 and was appointed in June 2009 to serve as a member of the Official Inquiry into Britain and the 2003 Iraq War. Sir Lawrence is widely published, and I'll include a link to all his published works in the show notes because it will take the whole episode to read through all his publications. But one of my favourite books is one of his. It's a Strategy, a History. It's a favourite for a couple of reasons, but mostly because of its breadth and depth, and it's helped me out on a few courses. I happen to have the print, ebook and audio book versions of it because of the nature of travelling and studying. You can actually find a link to it on the bookshelf on our website. But we're actually not talking about that book today. Today, we are looking back to the future and his new book, The Future of War, a History. So Lawrence, thanks very much for coming on the show.
Happy to be here.
Now, Sir Lawrence, before we start discussing the history of the future of war, which is a phrase that is confusing me at the moment, I'm interested to learn more about how you found yourself interested in becoming a historian and then focusing in the strategic studies area.
Well, I didn't start off as a historian. In fact, I've never done a history degree. I started off doing social sciences, and when I finished my undergraduate degree, when I finished my master's, I would have considered myself as much a political sociologist as anything else. But I ended up in Oxford, and my supervisor was Sir Michael Howard, who had an enormous influence on me, to whom my latest book is dedicated, in fact. And so I can almost identify the moment when, having found out that he was my supervisor, I went and read his Studies in War and Peace collection of essays, and more or less said, that's what I want to do. Mm-hmm. And I think I'd already by this time had an interest, not so much in military things in general, but in nuclear issues, nuclear strategy. And that's what I was going to work on. But he gave me a sort of a wider interest, but B, encouraged me, which I think was probably my natural tendency, to look at things historically. Yeah. So that's the moment the transition occurred, if you like.
It's interesting you mentioned your interest in nuclear areas. I've actually benefited from sitting through lectures on nuclear strategic theory, and I passed the exam, so I must have done all right. Now,
congratulations.
Your most recent book, as I said before, is called The Future of War, a History. I found it fascinating to read. A lot of books out there, they anticipate or predict what the future of war will look like. But this is actually a history on, I suppose, those sorts of ruminations. What motivated you to write a history about the future of war?
Well, I was going to write a book on the future of war. That was the original topic, about which I had some misgivings, but I thought, well, let's have a go. And then I thought, well, let's start by just looking back how people have done it in the past. This was going to be my first chapter, the history of the future of war. How have people looked at the future of war in the past? And then the more I looked at it, the more I was struck, A, by how wrong they often were, and B, how interesting their mistakes were, because it wasn't sort of just bad predictions or false reasoning. They were reflecting the assumptions of their time, which was interesting, but also often these books were prescriptive. They were talking about the future of war in order to stop people making mistakes, or to encourage them to follow their favoured policies, or to back their favoured military service. So the idea for the book really developed as an expanded first chapter. It just took over the whole book in the end, because it was actually a way into all the issues. So I don't think actually many of the issues that you might cover in a book entitled The Future of War are ducked. I think they're all there. But it approaches these books and the whole debate with a historical perspective, and with the aim of ensuring that we address the issues, but also are careful to take all these books with a pinch of salt.
I found the sections on H.G. Wells particularly interesting. He was pretty close in a few areas.
Yeah, H.G. Wells is a fascinating character. I don't think he's a great writer, but he was an incredibly popular writer, had a very fertile imagination, and also had a very strong point of view. And his objective in talking about the future of war was to describe situations in which the nations of the world will realize that they were just moving into one disaster after another and had to accept world government. So that was his underlying objective. But a lot of things like tanks, aircraft, air warfare, and even the atomic bomb were described by him, not exactly, but he's one of those figures who was so influential that even, say, just take the tank, when during the First World War the designs were being put together, H.G. Wells was sort of an inspiration. There's he had something called the Dreadnought, which was an enormous thing, which probably not have been practical. But he got the idea was influential, and so he was not only sort of prescient, but actually influenced things so that his ideas helped to come about. Even with the atomic bomb, it's called the atomic bomb because of H.G. Wells.
In the book, you've divided it into three parts roughly, and they correspond with overlapping historical periods since the 19th century. During the writing of the book, were there key trends or themes you discovered throughout this period about the predictions of the future of war?
I think there were two themes that recur. One is the idea of the successful surprise attack or knockout blow. I think anybody writing about the topic ends up having to address that, and works of fiction which address it also assume that if you're going to start a war, you're going to start it in the best possible circumstances. That means surprise, and if the surprise is really successful, then you take your opponent out of the whole conflict. Now, I suppose another theme is how rarely this is successful. It's not inevitably failure, but as often as not it does fail for reasons that are often foreseeable. And this is true with the two great surprise attacks of 1941, the Hitler's against the Soviet Union in June and Pearl Harbor in December 1941. In both cases, those actually doing it, not necessarily Hitler, but certainly the generals knew just what a gamble this was. And certainly that was true with Pearl Harbor, because there was no actual plan for the Japanese to really follow it up against the United States itself. They couldn't defeat America. So So one of the big themes which really interests me is this preoccupation with surprise attack and knockout blows. The other, which is more difficult, is the role of the civilians in war, or particularly civilians as targets in war. During the 19th century, when talking at least about big war between big powers, the assumption was that the warfare could be in some way contained. Yeah, it's evident when either one looks at imperialism or the experience of the American Civil War or the end of the aftermath of the Franco-Prussian War, the civilians kept on being drawn in because they were acting as irregulars, or they just were seen as soft targets. And as you move to air power and let alone nuclear weapons, this becomes more and more important. And it's an issue which I think writers on military affairs find incredibly hard to handle. They find it very difficult because it's part of the professional ethos that they should be fighting each other rather than civilians. Yet civilians keep on being entangled in wars and becoming not only just the targets in an operational sense as a way of bringing the war to an end, but also the reason why wars are fought, as with the Holocaust. So I found that issue it was an intriguing and difficult issue, but one that takes a variety of forms throughout the book, but it's always present.
The civilian thing I found recurring throughout the book. It doesn't really jump out to you until you just as you're reading, you're like again and again civilians being used, or as you say, what was called the revolution in military affairs and the precision weapons help you avoid targeting civilians. They also, if you want to target civilian facilities, help you target them very accurately.
Indeed, as we've just seen in Aleppo and so on. It allows you to avoid hitting a hospital, it allows you to hit a hospital if that's what you wish to do.
Yeah, it's actually a rather morose point, but it was crystal clear when I read it. I was like, of course. Now, during your book, you mentioned a few key prognosticators. We've also talked about H.G. Wells already. But how influential were those individuals in writing about the future of war, particularly the early to mid 20th century, after they started to experience things like the Great War and then the Second World War?
I think you'll find certain individuals are read a lot, but as often as not, you're looking at trends of opinion in which a number of people are contributing. I think Wells was a bit unusual in that he sort of stuck out as somebody who looked quite far ahead. He was using science fiction in some ways, what we now call science fiction. Mm-hmm. Most of the writers on the future of war were really addressing immediate issues and fitted in with, as I say, with general trends of opinion. I think basically a lot of it was around the concept of air war. I mean, in the interwar period, and the novelists, for example, took a very dystopian view about what the impact of air war would be on ordinary populations. You don't find anybody really in this literature saying it's not going to happen or it's much more difficult. The general view is the bomber will get through and it's going to be horrible. Yeah. So I don't think that there's particular individuals leading the way during that period as much as they had done perhaps in the pre-First World War period.
And towards the end of the book, you focus on current debates on war's future. Particularly some of the key terms that are hotly debated, things like cyber war, hybrid war. You also finish up with the final chapter being the future of war. Now, without giving away the ending, because we still want people to go out there and buy the book and buy it in bulk loads or land shiploads, what can you tell us about how we currently see the future of war?
Yeah, well, I'm not a thriller, so it doesn't matter if you really know the end. The point about the future of war is that this tendency to think in terms of knockout blows encourages say, when we're looking at cyber, talk of an electronic Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
The idea that one day the society's plug will be pulled out, everything will go dark, air traffic control, the banking system, all communications, and so on and so forth. So it encourages an approach that looks at the most dramatic outcomes, whereas in practice, cyber attacks of one sort or another are regular and continuous. A lot of them criminal activity or political mischief making, as we've seen, but they're not sort of decisive in the way that we think of defeating an enemy's army in battle is going to be decisive. And in the end, cyber attacks don't allow you to occupy territory. Yeah. So I think that there's we use military analogies to describe stuff that is not quite military. That's one issue. Secondly, and related to that, the natural tendency to focus on what technology can do for you and what difference technology will make encourages very interesting discussions of autonomous vehicles and robotics and so on, which you can already see being influential, if not, again, necessarily decisive in Western armed forces. But in practice, and it comes back to the issue of civilians, most wars at the moment and wars in the future will probably be the grinding sorts of civil wars that we've seen a lot of recently, with Syria and Iraq, but and Afghanistan, but lots going on in sub-Saharan Africa, Democratic Republic of the Congo, South Sudan, and so on and so forth. I mean, and these are not high-tech wars. They may use the sort of technology we've all got in our pockets at the moment with our smartphones, but people are killed in ways that they've been killed for many decades in conflict. So I think part of it is realizing, the best predictor of future war is past war. Where wars have happened in the past, they're likely to recur, and there's good reasons for that because the political tensions remain present, and the weaponry of war evolves, and in many cases doesn't change that much. People get killed by machetes as well as AK-47s and so on. So I think that's sort of a corrective to the sort of gee whiz school of future war, which is always focused on what technology is going to do for you in the next generation.
I found the bit about cyber most interesting because I've only recently read Neuromancer, which the historians at our Australian War Memorial have told me I'm quite slack for not having read Neuromancer a long time ago. But I was over the moon when you quoted it, and then in one of your other chapters you talked about the Death Star and the procurement issues that the US would face. I thought that was quite interesting. So listeners, you're going to have to buy the book to find out what we're talking about when it comes to the Death Star, and also if you haven't read Neuromancer by William Gibbon, it focuses on the first use of the term cyber war. Now, Sir Lawrence, I could sit here and waste your entire day talking about your book and just picking your brain, but I know you're a very busy man. You've got places to be. So I will ask you to pay the butcher's bill now, which is the final question every guest gets on this show. And it relates to our mission on the show to define war in as many ways as possible, just like Big Carl, the dead Prussian himself, and encourage more debate on war the way Carl would have appreciated it. And funnily enough, your supervisor and mentor is responsible for the book that got me into reading about Clausewitz. So that actually works really, really well in a nice little circle. So I'll ask you now, Sir Lawrence, to finish the sentence, war is.
War is fascinating as well as terrifying because I think there's a duality in warfare between the chaos and mayhem and destruction which it often brings about, and which, too often I think people who write about warfare play down, but is an unavoidable aspect of violence. But at the same time, it has moments of bravery and heroism and solidarity and loyalty, which is another reason why people are drawn to its study. So I think that the answer to the question war is becoming increasingly difficult, because the boundaries of war are being blurred all the time. In the past, you would have known what is war and what is peace, what is civil, what is military, what is political, what's criminal, and so on. All of these boundaries are becoming blurred, but at all times you're talking about violence, and you're therefore dealing with the contrary emotions that violence draws out.
That is a new definition, and after over 40-something episodes, it's getting quite hard for guests. So, Lawrence, I think you've done extraordinarily well there, which is not surprising. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
My pleasure.
Now, listeners, please make sure you check out the book, The Future of War, A History. You can go to the bookshelf on our website and click on it there. They'll take you to Book Depository, which is a UK company, and as you can hear from Sir Lawrence's accent, it would probably service his community if you buy it from Book Depository. It'll also help us with our hosting fees as well. You can get it free shipping globally, which for some of my more obtuse listeners, that means everywhere in the world. Now, you can also follow Sir Lawrence on Twitter. Twitter is our favourite place to be, and that is @LawDAVF. On Twitter, make sure you follow him, and you can get some great tweets, particularly calling out J.K. Rowling today on the 280 versus 140 characters. I think that's
the biggest dispute I've ever been involved in.
Not the biggest, but certainly the most humorous for today. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that's all I have. So grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter @DeadPrussianPod, on Facebook @The Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.